We have Tala Alsharif with us on the phone line. She is a researcher at the University of British Columbia's Department of Civil Engineering, and she is the co-author of this study, which talks about how unsafe it is if you text and walk. Good evening, Tala. How are you?
Good evening, Mani. I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good too. Thank you so much. I got scared because I don't drive, and I make it. When I was in India, I was absolutely careful about it that I will never text when I'm driving, even when I'm stopping at a traffic signal. Mm-hmm. But I use the public transport here, and I walk a lot, and I use my phone, and my headphones are always on, and I'm either texting or WhatsApping or tweeting or watching content and going on. Your research tells me that what I'm doing is making me unsafe. Is that right?
That's correct. And you're not alone. I think this is a very common phenomenon. It is a recent one, however.
Be honest. Do you do it as well?
I try not to. I think ever since I started this research, I've been a lot more vigilant, and, especially when crossing. I think if you're on the sidewalk, it should be fine as long as you're not bumping into anyone. Mm-hmm. But when you're crossing the road, there's definitely reason to put it, have your head up and put your phone down. And this study was about quantifying just how risky it is for you to do this, to be distracted while you're crossing the road. So sort of the essence of the study is to look at that, but also to understand how the behavior of the individual changes when you're distracted when crossing versus not.
How different is your research from other researchers? Because I was assuming that this was known already, but how different is your study? What is it that you have found out which is not there in other studies previously?
That's an excellent question. First of all, whether it is this study or other studies, the idea of studying pedestrians in particular, but distracted pedestrians specifically, is a very new concept. I mean, if you look at cell phone usage, that started in the 70s. The first text message was sent in the 90s. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine that there's not a lot of research on pedestrians. You'll find a lot on distracted driving, not so much on distracted pedestrians, just because it was not considered a contributing factor until recently when it comes to road risk, road collisions, etc. However, as people are becoming more distracted by their phones, as you mentioned, you're always either on your headphones or you're texting while you're walking on the street. This is a topic that researchers need to do more work on. And what makes this particular research unique is that we try to employ AI models in order to understand the behavioral trends between distracted and non-distracted pedestrians. Mm-hmm. It is the first of its kind to use these kinds of models, and also to try to see how their performance differs. So is it easier to predict non-distracted behavior versus distracted behavior when we're looking at modeling pedestrians using simulation models? That's a very important question because now I'm working in industry, and we depend a lot on simulation models when we're designing infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So if we're using the model pedestrian in order to design our infrastructure, we're not accounting for the most vulnerable, being distracted pedestrians, and we have to put more work into representing them in these kinds of studies in order to make sure that we're building a road environment that is safe for them and not just safe for the model pedestrian who would perhaps move at a normal speed, look both ways, maintain a specific proximity to vehicles, or like yield to traffic when they realize it's unsafe for them to cross. This might not be the reality. From what our study has shown, pedestrians that are distracted actually move slower. They tend to be a lot closer in terms of proximity to vehicles. They're much less likely to yield to traffic compared to their non-distracted pedestrian counterparts. So all these things are things that were highlighted in the study that are perhaps not as focused on in other studies, and specifically focusing on identifying these behavioral trends and quantifying them into percentages.
In a country like Canada and especially BC, where pedestrians have the right of way, you're saying that they are still at a risk of having a severe interaction with vehicles if they're not careful, if they're on the phone. Because I feel like a king after coming to Canada. I just think that, well, whenever there is a crossing, I can just walk whenever the light is on. Or even if there's no light, I can just straight away go ahead. You were saying that even with the rules in place, this is still risky.
Wonderful question. I love your question so far. Yes, unfortunately, I will say this, that what we have noticed when we started this study, our focus was pedestrians and trying to differentiate non-distracted versus distracted pedestrians. However, what you said is true. The drivers are actually much more cautious here in Vancouver, and in particular these two intersections, when they notice that a pedestrian is distracted. And this is, of course, a good sign when we think about Vancouver and the fact that vehicles tend to yield to pedestrians. However, I will point out that this might be on surface a positive thing. It's important for us to understand that when a vehicle is focused on that particular pedestrian, they're not focused on the rest of their environment. Another thing is this might be a behavior that we've noticed in the majority of drivers when they notice that a pedestrian is distracted, but there's always that exception. And it's important that when we're dealing with these sort of close calls or near misses where a vehicle perhaps does not uphold, let's say, the rules of being more vigilant around pedestrians, pedestrians should take responsibility for their safety. So not make it so that if the driver is going to be a safe driver, therefore they will be safe, but rather in that moment when they are being exposed to that potential risk, they're aware that this could happen and therefore taking sort of that initiative and ensuring their own safety. And our study is about raising awareness. By no means are we making the pedestrian responsible in that particular situation, but we're telling them that this is a risk that you are more exposed to in the scenario of distraction, and perhaps to increase your chance of safety, make sure that when you are crossing, you are aware of your environment, you are taking the proper safety maneuver. And of course, our hope is that drivers as well are aware that distracted pedestrians might not exhibit the same predictable behavior that other pedestrians do.
Now that I'm listening to you, I just remember that I had a very different sort of an experience in Montreal where I thought that people were a lot more lax in following traffic rules, especially at intersections and sidewalks. How can the existing infrastructure be modified to support pedestrians better? Are there tools that you have thought of that can be utilized to make jaywalking or to limit jaywalking among pedestrians? Because no matter how much you tell people, but at the end of the day, they still would love to listen to their music, or they would still have their iPods on. It might take a very long time for behavioral change to occur. Until that time, how can the existing infrastructure, the road infrastructure, the signage and all of that, how can they be modified so that people are supported better?
Yeah, so when we're talking infrastructure change, one of the things that we looked at was model performance. And the reason we decided to look at that is because these models are what we use to quantify the changes we need to make. When it comes to infrastructure change, many things could be introduced, whether it's raised crosswalks, perhaps auditory warnings for these pedestrians that are visually distracted, meaning they're texting or they're scrolling on their phones. Having signs on the road for those who are perhaps listening to music or speaking on the phone, put your phone down when you're crossing. And by no means are we telling pedestrians not to do these things at all when they're on a sidewalk, for example. But in that moment when they are perhaps on a pedestrian crosswalk or at a busy intersection, it is for their own good that they do this. And just like anything else, I think when we're dealing with road safety, we have the 5 E's, which is engineering, that is, what I mentioned, infrastructure,
right,
and collecting data and doing research. But we also have factors such as engagement, education, ensuring that we are evaluating how behaviors are changing as we are tackling these issues and making the public aware of them. And the reason I think education in that particular case is important, in other studies that I've read while doing this work, the people who tend to use their phones the most when they're on the road or take more risky behavior are children. And so this is why this kind of initiative is important. Like I said, the phone usage is a new phenomenon when it comes to the frequency of it, the accessibility of it. And so we have to make sure that we're using it responsibly in order to ensure our own safety and the safety of the people around us when we're on the road.
How can your research be expanded? What are the future pathways that you think your research are creating for other researchers?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to be picked up from this research. I think we've only scratched the surface when it comes to looking at distracted behavior. For now, we've looked at non-distracted versus distracted. When we're looking at the types of distraction, there's auditory, like I said, and then there's visual. And the dynamic and behavior changes when you're looking at a visually distracted pedestrian or an auditory one. And so having research that would look at these differences, I think, would be very beneficial. Another thing is looking at different urban settings, or maybe even adding more intersections and collecting more data. With the work we did has been at 2 intersections that are very busy in Vancouver, but perhaps expanding it to other areas, I think, would help us quantify risk more and understand exactly the types of road safety risks that would be impacted in terms of safety for the pedestrians, and looking at other urban settings, maybe like you said, looking at Montreal.
Yeah, Montreal would be a good place to start, I think, the next phase of your research.
Yeah, so there's many ways to take this, and I think it's important that we look at different cities, different countries, and just try to understand how risk changes from one place to the other.
Tala Alsharif, thank you so much for making time for this conversation with us. It was lovely speaking with you, and thank you for sharing these insights with our audience.
Thank you, Mani. Have a good night.
You too.